All right, in this short and sweet example, we have a very exciting use case for identifying what may or may not be personally identifiable or otherwise sensitive data. So what we'll be using is we'll have three key components. One is, of course, the SnapLogic platform itself. Secondly, be using a large language model to aid us. And lastly, we'll need our data source. In this case, we'll be using Salesforce, but due to how SnapLogic is designed to treat any data in a standardized format known as JSON, this could be literally any data type under the sun, so any of your systems. So what we start off is a list of contacts, which will contain series of very sensitive fields such as addresses, first name, last name, phone numbers, and other identifiable data. So what we're doing is the challenge that we have is we could ask a large language model to identify is this data risky or not. But if we're sending sensitive data to a large language model in order to find out if the data is sensitive, we've already failed at our task. So what we'll be doing instead, and thanks to SnapLogic, is, well, first of all, we'll only take a snapshot of the data, in this case, one record, because what we don't want is the actual information, the actual sensitive data. What we do want is a list of fields. So what we'll do is we'll extract a list of field names. In this case, essentially every single field that's contained in our overall object. So things like ID is deleted, account name, last name, essentially every other field. And we'll be using field names to make an assumption of whether this may or may not contain sensitive data. Most of the magic happens in the actual prompt. So we'll be using SnapLogic's prompt composer, and what we'll be providing is a list of fields and an elaborate set of instructions. So what we're asking it to create a JSON object that's called risk analysis, which will contain a set of fields. The actual name of the field being analyzed, score of how likely it is to be a high risk field, the reason for why we feel that way, and the confidence that a large language model has. We provide some additional guidance. And lastly, we add a few additional details. First of all, in this example, we don't actually consider any field labeled as ID to be sensitive because it's very specific to our system. And in this case, we're assuming this is not a risk factor, while a large language model by default would assume this to be a high risk scenario. So we're telling it to essentially say that anything that has an ID is actually a low risk due to it being a system specific field. Lastly, what we're telling it is for things like addresses, which in systems like Salesforce is actually consisting of five or more separated fields. We're telling it to look at the overall set of fields and go, if there's enough information to make up a full address, then consider every single one of those fields sensitive. If it's not a risk, then consider all of them to be low risk. Finally, we provide the actual field names and we let it do its magic. So SnapLogic and the large language model does its processing. And what it does is extract a list of risk scores, in which case what we have is our output, which has an elaborate risk analysis for the scoring criteria, the reason, and all the fields we requested. What we're doing now is we're taking out anything that's over a score of 6. We'll assume that this is actually a high risk field. So we're extracting all our risky field names and we're categorizing them as high risk fields and low risk fields for anything under 6. Finally, what we do, because so far we've only taken the field names and one record, we merge all the information around the risky fields along with the actual data coming from the previous step. And the last step we will do over here is we're redacting the actual data. So we're going through the information coming in which case we can see it starts off being fairly unfiltered. Actually, we can change the view as well to be a bit more visible. So here we can see we have all the information like first name, last name, address details, etc., all available in plain text. But once we run it past the redacted list, what we get is we can see that essentially anything that we considered sensitive has now been redacted, whereas things like salutation, account ID, and basically fields marked with ID that we said, hey, this is not actually a high risk field, we decided to keep in plain text to show the difference. And lastly, we do a little bit of cleanup because we no longer need our information about which fields are high and which fields are low risk. And we end up with a nicely formatted result, which automatically redacted anything that can be considered as sensitive data. The best part is, if we were to replace the Salesforce read over here with any data source we can come up with, the actual logic remains the same, making this almost infinitely reusable. That's it for today. Thank you.